This video is going to talk about giving feedback to students, feedback strategies and content. How to give feedback to your students. It's from a book of the same title by Susan Brookhardt. And I want to start with a little bit of research on comments, scores, or comments and scores. What do you think is best? Do students learn more when we give them a score? Do they learn more when we only give them comments? Or do they learn best when we give them scores and comments? So this is a research study in which a number of students, both at the top and bottom of each class, were given 3 different types of feedback. And what do you think? When did we have the most gain in achievement? When there were scores, scores and comments, or just comments? The research was pretty clear that when we gave scores, there was no gain in achievement. While it was positive for the high scores, they felt good about what they did, it was pretty negative for low scores, as you might imagine. When we just gave comments, when students didn't have a score atop their assignment, there was a 30% gain in achievement. And guess what? Both the students that did well and the students that still had some growth to show, they both felt positive about the feedback they were given. When there were scores and comments again, guess what happened? We had no gain. Again, the high scores felt positive, low scores felt negative. The bottom line is this: when you provide a score, it elicits an emotional response. It also signifies an end to the learning. It doesn't matter what feedback you give students after you pair it with a score. It is most likely that they're kind of, if not totally, put on the defensive by the score, and or the comments don't mean much to them because they feel like it is already an end to their learning. So why is feedback important? Why are comments that we give to students important? Getting something wrong and then getting it right is a fundamental process for learning. We need to teach students that. They need to hear that constantly. The focus of feedback is to spend less time on labeling something wrong and more time on getting to the work of fixing it. Our feedback, the comments we provide for students, should be minimal and specifically targeted to whatever it is we intended for students to learn or be able to do at the onset of learning. Sometimes we give feedback on things that weren't even a part of what we were intending to teach, and it only clutters what it is we want for students to be able to process and do differently as a result of what we're telling them. Feedback should show students that their ability is incremental rather than fixed. We need to help them see that learning is a process that takes time. That with this little bit of feedback I'm giving you, your learning is going to slowly, incrementally improve, and that at no point should you ever assume your intelligence or learning in general is a fixed entity. So, focus on the right answers. Don't flatter, don't fuss in terms of your feedback. Too much fuss may indicate to a student you're surprised that they got it right. So, when students do well, don't overpraise what it is they did well. Don't be surprised suddenly and make it appear as though you didn't think they would get the work done. Instead, show students you expect both right and wrong answers to happen by not making too big a deal out of either. And just understand that feedback should always cause thinking. Students should always think about what it is you told them to do and apply that in some way, shape, or form to ensure they're actually using that feedback to improve their learning. Help students understand where they are in their learning and what to do next. Give them both the target for learning and the success criteria so they have an opportunity to know what to do with that feedback. Again, I like things that are sticky. I like making things easy for both me and for the students. So think of feedback as fast. It's fair, accurate, specific, and timely. So let's talk about timing. When do you give feedback and how often do you give it? First, immediate feedback is correcting the knowledge of facts, right versus wrong. You might give that orally right away. Delayed feedback is going to be more comprehensive review of student thinking and processing. So, think about the 2 different types and the frequency with which you're going to give them. And when the delayed feedback is happening, understand that it's really less about whether things are right or wrong, and more about getting students to think critically. You should give feedback for all major assignments, and you should do that with some checkpoints along the way so that within the amount of time that you're giving students to complete the major assignment, they have ample opportunity to give you feedback, hand it back in, get more feedback from you, etc. Give feedback as often as it's practical. You can't break the time bank trying to constantly give feedback, but it is an important part of what you do. And make sure you're giving it when it would make a difference to students and make a difference to student learning. So how about the amount of feedback you should give? I think it's important that you do prioritize your feedback. Give only the most important points. This is what it means to be specific. Choose points that relate to your learning goals and success criteria. Let other mistakes or other things that you might want to give feedback on, let them go. Also, make sure your feedback considers the developmental level of the student. Make sure it's written in such a way that they can actually understand. So how about the mode? There's a couple different modes in which you give feedback. Obviously, there's oral feedback, there's written feedback, there's a visual demonstration of feedback. I think interactive oral feedback is best whenever possible. I think it's great if you can conference one-on-one with students. I think it's important that you consider what the feedback is and the response that a student might have in receiving it to know whether or not you can give that feedback in front of other people. An oral feedback is a quick comment versus a conference. Obviously, written feedback is on written work or student assignments in general. If you need to do how to do something, it's probably going to be whole group, or if it is small group, it might take place outside of your actual class period or the time in which you've dedicated to a specific content area. But it is important that you do sometimes allow for the visual representation of the feedback that you're giving. So again, that idea of audience is individual or group or class feedback. This is a decision that you would need to make, sometimes need to make it on the fly. But individual feedback says to students, the teacher values me and values my learning. So please know, the more frequently you are pulling students aside to give them timely, specific, fair feedback, the more likely they are to view that you value them and their learning. Group class feedback is important too. I think it's really important to look at the percentage of students that answered a particular question or a particular set of questions correctly, and to give some feedback and possibly reteach on that same concept. It is a way to give that highly effective all-class feedback. So, the focus. What do I give feedback on? Is it the work itself, or is it the process the students used, the extent of student self-regulation, or the student personally? These are all really good questions. Whenever possible, I think it's really good to give feedback that describes both the student's work and the process of doing the work. In order to do that, you've got to get students to reflect on their process, and I think that's really good practice in general. To whenever you've got a fairly significant assignment or project, that you are also asking students to talk about how they moved from not knowing much about this concept to now knowing it. Get them to reflect on that, and to reflect on the relationship between what they did and what they learned. Comment on the student's self-regulation if you feel the comment will foster self-efficacy, if you feel like it will build their mindset, their growth mindset. And then definitely avoid personal comments. We don't want students to internalize the feedback when it's given to them in such a way that it requires them to change what they did. It's not about who they are, it's about the work they produced at that time. It's okay where you're at, it's not okay to stay there. I really think comparisons are important. Comparisons in rubrics with learning goals and success criteria is the key to giving highly effective feedback, primarily because students can give themselves their own feedback by comparing the work they completed to what you said were varying levels of success in a rubric, such as beginning success looks like this, developing success looks like this, secure success looks like this. Compare where you're at based on the work that you're submitting. Use your learning goals and success criteria for giving information about the work itself. It's really important to be able to do that. Have students compare their work to other students' work. And it doesn't have to be students currently in the class. It can be exemplars from students that previously completed the assignment. And then again, use self-reference feedback for unsuccessful learners who need to see the progress they've made, not how far they are from the learning goal. The key being, if students are struggling to make the progress you would hope they're making in terms of the amount of time you have, they may be realizing that as well, and they may need to be reminded that yes, the speed with which they're making progress may not be exactly what we had all hoped, but they do need to see that they have moved from where they started to where they are now, and to start building some belief and then spending some extra time reteaching or being a guide on the side to help them speed up that slow incremental growth. So the function of your feedback, is it description versus judgment? Effective feedback is meant to be descriptive, not judgmental. When it's judgmental, students start making decisions about who they are as learners in a way that we're definitely not going to like or is going to be productive to being successful in class. Some students will hear feedback as judgmental even when it's meant to be descriptive. We have to know that. We have to look and try to recognize when that's happening. The key is to maximize the chances that your feedback is heard as descriptive. And so the way to do that is to give students lots of opportunities to practice and receive feedback without a grade. Make feedback observational. Describe what it is you see as opposed to what specifically students have done or are showing they know. How can you evaluate then if you don't provide a score? Descriptive feedback is given during assessments for. And again, a lot of what you do in your teaching should be for learning. It shouldn't be an assessment of learning. Assessments for learning are formative. They're formative tasks, homework, daily work, quizzes, etc. Assessments of learning should come much later, and you should be comfortable with what students have shown on their formative work to know that they're ready to take a summative assessment, because it's the summative assessment, the opportunity where they actually are earning a score and a grade, that ultimately is going to be the way you provide that judgment. But you are providing at a time in which you know students are actually ready, that they've done the requisite learning to actually receive the score. So positive or negative feedback, because sometimes it's going to have to be both. I do think you can use positive comments that describe what is done well. It's important that feedback start with some praise, and usually, hopefully, you are praising the process that they went through. But you also want to identify what's the last thing they did correctly before they made the mistake. Praise, then prompt. So describe how the strength in the student's work matches the learning goals and success criteria. Always reference the success criteria. Always reference where they are in comparison to the success criteria. Help them understand the dynamic between the two. Point out where improvement is needed. Suggest specifically what the student can do about it. So general praise is good. Negative evaluation, punishments, and general criticism is never going to be good. The reason I say feedback is sometimes positive and negative is because it's in the eye of the beholder. You may feel like the feedback you're giving students is positive, but if it's perceived by the student as negative, it is indeed negative. I always help students understand that my feedback is intended to be positive, that descriptive feedback is intended to be constructive. And that the intentions are always good in giving it to students. Clarity is important. Clarity of learning targets, clarity of success criteria, and clarity of feedback. John Hattie shows this in his effect size research. So it's important to use student-friendly language, student-friendly vocabulary and concepts when giving your vocabulary. Tailor the amount, make it specific, make it small to each student's developmental level. And then check that the student understands. Have them paraphrase the feedback you've given them. Have them describe for you. Maybe it's your exit slip for the day in which you've provided feedback to students. What will you do differently on this assignment as a result of receiving my feedback? So a part of FAST again is specificity. And you should ask yourself, am I being too picky or am I being too general? Tailor the amount of feedback you're giving students. Make it specific enough that they know what to do, but not so specific that the work is done for them. It's really easy to provide feedback that doesn't cause thinking. To give feedback that just says, do this, and hand it in again, because you know you'll have it by the end of the hour and it can then go in the grade book if you're ultimately giving a score for it. Identify errors or types of errors, but avoid correcting every single one. Like, for example, adding the punctuation or adding the capitalization or rewriting a thesis statement that's more clear and concise. And then avoid statements like try harder, write more, good job. Avoid statements that aren't specific, that don't actually provide meaningful feedback to students. It'll save you a lot of time to avoid those statements because giving feedback does take time. So what will the students hear when you give them feedback? It's important to ask that question because you need to choose words that communicate respect for the student and words that clearly show value in who they are as a learner and the work that they've submitted. Choose words that position the student as the agent, as though they are submitting a proposal to you of some sort, as though you are hoping to continually earn their business. Choose words that cause students to think or wonder. It's super important that it cause learning and work on behalf of the student. Ask questions. I think that's a really important feedback or oral feedback. Ask questions instead of telling students what to do. Share what you are wondering about. Model some curiosity. So those are strategies for feedback. I hope that's helpful to you. I hope you're able to take some notes and that you have a strong sense of how to give